Thanks for being with us at this conference. You both gave excellent presentations this afternoon. We had a lively discussion about problems of global justice as they relate to power and citizenship and social justice. So I'll start with David. Are there universal categories of things that all human beings need? And can we identify a language to talk about global justice across borders in your view?
Yeah, I think you can. I think that people all over the world often, not always, want to be able to be involved in making decisions that affect their lives. Sometimes they internalize a view that they don't have any worth and that they should listen to somebody else. But when they have an opportunity to be exposed to a variety of things, they want to be involved in making decisions themselves. So I would say agency or autonomy or self-determination is something that all people should want, and many people do want. And I think events in Tunisia in the last 2 weeks indicate that a country in which people had prosperity and enough to eat, that wasn't enough. They wanted to have freedom of thought and be able to participate in their own government.
Okay. And what's the relationship between citizenship and social justice? Why are the two linked together?
Well, I think that social justice, it's easy to approach it in a way of asking philosophers to define social justice. I think a better way is to ask the community themselves to deliberate about it, to decide what is just in their context as they are in interaction with other communities around the world and with a doctrine of human rights, which it seems to me embodies a lot of the universal claims that we all hold dear, whether we're Americans or Indians or Venezuelans or whatever.
How do the academic traditions of thinking about justice in a national context, exemplified by someone like John Rawls, how do they help us think through thinking through what these justice obligations are in this international context?
Right. Well, of course, they give us principles that we might then use to pay attention to the way that the costs and benefits of climate change are distributed. There's the costs in terms of environmental impacts and damages felt by people, and the benefits either in foregone harm or the way in which we are allowed to emit carbon, something that's associated with affluence. And so really the frameworks that academics have developed around cosmopolitan justice are quite helpful for thinking both about the climate change as a problem and climate policy solutions and evaluating them. Of course, there are hitches in some of the ongoing debates about whether justice applies beyond borders. There are some ambiguities exactly how we might think of the burdens being distributed. But the theories have been quite helpful, and a lot of my work in recent years has been trying to really marshal those theories to make sense of different kinds of proposals for climate policy.
Well, what responsibilities do you think the American people have and the American body politic has in responding to this problem, and are we meeting them?
Right, yeah. One responsibility that I'll talk a bit about tomorrow is to engage the issue a bit more, and I think that's something where we've been most irresponsible thus far. For example, many Americans are still, public opinion surveys show, skeptical about the science behind climate change. There's a kind of denial that there's any sort of problem being caused, and so no real engagement about the ethical question, what Americans should do to try and mitigate the effects of climate change or assist people in adapting to it. And so I'd say the main thing that we ought to do is to confront the issue head on and really ask ourselves the serious ethical question. What do we owe those whose well-being is adversely affected by the way in which we've designed our economy, our transit infrastructure, and so on? Apart from engaging the issue, of course, we have to take seriously a kind of internationalism that Americans have been reluctant to accept, a concern about impacts beyond our borders, but also an engagement in international institutions, which lately has been something that Americans haven't been willing to participate in.
So both of you write about the obligations of people in affluent countries to the rest of the world. And maybe I'll start asking both of you, what ethical responsibilities do affluent Americans or affluent consumers in industrialized countries have to that portion of humanity that is living on very low income, in your view?
Well, I think if we focus in particular on people who are working in under difficult working conditions, those difficult working conditions are, of course, sustained by the fact that there are people in the first world who are willing to buy the products of companies that have these kinds of factories with these sorts of conditions. So if you think about the case of Nike, for example, a well-known case where Nike was associated with factories that used child labor. And the only reason those factories could exist is because there were people in the first world willing to buy sneakers that were made in Nike factories. So the question is, well, what obligation do people in the first world have who are buying these products? I think that it's very important to keep in mind that the first obligation really lies with the legislatures in these countries to institute laws to protect their workers. And that the best solution is always for there to be a kind of legislative solution, because that's one where citizens get to talk to each other and really air out all of the arguments on the various sides and take different things into account. But I think if legislatures are not up to the task, then I think that consumers do have some responsibility to get involved and try to find out where their products are coming from, and to take steps to try and discourage companies from pursuing these sorts of production processes. At the same time, though, you don't want consumers to take on all of the responsibility and then leave corporations off the hook, or to then take investors off the hook, or even other workers off the hook, because any of these parties corporations could restrain themselves and not exploit workers. Investors could put pressure on corporations not to engage in these sorts of practices by refusing to invest money in companies that do this sort of thing. So I think that the obligation is at the same time tempered, because you don't want people in the first world to say, okay, it's our responsibility, and therefore we can let everybody else off the hook.
Yeah, and I would say that my work is largely oriented around people of privilege in the first world, and trying to help them recognize and understand what their obligations are to people both in this country and in other places who may not have the benefit of similar privileges. And so the first step for me in that obligation is recognizing that privilege. And I would say that most people in the first world have some level of privilege vis-a-vis people in the developing world, two-thirds world. But for those who have education or middle class or affluent status, I think the obligation increases. And I agree with what you're saying, that it can't solely be the obligation of the consumers, and that there is a role for, an important role for states and businesses and investor accountability. But I think that in the world that we have right now, there is an enormous obligation on the part of consumers to know where their products are coming from. And I think that the difficulty with that is that the processes of production are so mystified that it's almost impossible for people to know where their products are being made, even if they have an interest in that.
What, in your opinion, is the biggest blind spot of economics as it's usually practiced, and what's the biggest blind spot of a sort of Christian ethics that doesn't pay attention to economics?
Well, as you're implying, every discipline has its way of thinking about the world, and we get caught up in that. It's usually very helpful, and so we find it very persuasive, but we lose track of the fact that it's only one way to think about the world. So the economist tends to think about how people will decide out of their self-interest. And if you want to decide what will happen when the price of gasoline goes up because of this recession coming to an end and an increase in economic activity, the economists can predict very well what will happen to the price of gasoline. It's going to rise because demand rises. But if you ask the economists, well, is that just? And is there a widow somewhere in Richmond whose fuel oil is going to rise, and what should we do about that? they don't know what to say because they're not used to talking about moral issues. Whereas the ethicist takes the other point of view and knows what to do about issues of justice, but sometimes might be impractical about issues of economics and might call for a change here or there that really doesn't make much sense economically. So it's a real challenge to get both groups together in conversation in a way they can understand each other.
Fortunately, we have a few people that are able to do well in both, Amartya Sen being both an economist and an ethicist philosopher. And I think the way he would put it would be similar to the way Dan put it, that economics can deal with issues of economic growth, of causes of prosperity and deprivation, but it can't deal very well with questions of distribution, of who should get what and who should make the decisions about that. So he's tried to bring together, not on a religious basis, but on a secular philosophical basis, a rapprochement between economics and ethics, where they're doing different things, but each needs the other.
When leaders fail to, show moral courage, I think you used the term moral cowardice to describe some of what's happened in the United States. What responsibilities then fall on citizens in democracy when the leaders aren't doing what's morally required?
Yeah, I mean, that's a tough question. Sometimes leaders don't lead because they feel constrained by the publics, that they're worried about not re-electing them. Sometimes leaders fail to lead and need to be nudged by the public. In this case, I'm not sure which is the more accurate description of why Obama hasn't been more successful in leading on climate policy. I think where there's some role for the public to play, it's in the engagement of the public at large with the real issues of climate change, of conveying what science has told us about the cause and effect of climate change, but also taking seriously the global challenges. Unless the public at large is willing to see this as something that we need to do and is in the country's not only national interest, but also interest as a kind of global leader, then we perhaps can't expect too much from our political leaders who have to concede to political reality at times like this and not get too far in front of public opinion.
Toddy, in your experience teaching and thinking about these issues and doing a lot of work with religious communities, what is it that makes privileged Americans' light bulbs go off when it does go off, to really start thinking about these issues and thinking about it in a serious way, something that might affect how they live their lives?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's one of the things I've been working on the last several years, because my interest really is in trying to figure out how to motivate people to get engaged and get involved in making change. And I don't think there's any one sort of galvanizing experience or revelatory piece of information that sort of transforms them. But I think that part of what I'm working on in the ethic of solidarity that I'm developing is that I do think people have to have this sort of metanoia moment where they have this sort of transformational experience. And I think that for some people it happens when it's an intellectual process. They may go through it in college or reading an article or learning something. For some people it's an experiential occasion where they go on maybe a mission trip, or they go to another country and they have experience with people. But I think that that the important thing about that sort of transformative experience is that it has to be sustained, and that it has to be the basis for developing relationships with people who are different from ourselves. I am a hopeful person, and I come from privilege, and it would be easy for me to just recede into that privilege and live a very comfortable life, but that's not satisfying, because that is at odds with everything I believe about how the world should be ordered. And in order to find joy in my life and to create meaning in my life, I find that every day I have to be engaged in the struggle for justice. And
in trying to encourage other people to be engaged in the struggle for justice, because the fact that I can walk away is a privilege, but it's also a curse. And I think it's part of what is the heart of global injustice, is the fact that some people can check out of that. And I think that it can, engaging in that struggle brings a different sort of joy and meaning to life that I find very valuable.